You guys can see that. Hi there, everybody. My name is Michael Lay, and it is a bright and sunny day here in California. So today I'm going to make a presentation on sensory receptors and their links to the central nervous system for the purpose of the UNE online physiology course. Alrighty, so first I'm going to be starting with a PowerPoint, and then right after the PowerPoint, we can begin to answer all the questions on the screen right here. Okay, here goes. So, some general trends I'd like you guys to follow with me through this PowerPoint are that sensory receptors help us perceive our environment, including our five senses, as well as temperature, pain, and balance. Our sensory receptors transduce information from the environment, and importantly, transduce means the conversion of stimulus energy into information that can be processed with the nervous system. So that's what transduction is. So these signals that are transduced generate action potentials, which are then sensed by primary sensory neurons and transmitted from the periphery to the brain in varying different processes, which I'll elaborate on in a little bit. So I'd also like you guys to know that perception of sensory information is sensed both ipsilaterally and contralaterally, depending on the sense. So let's talk about different sensory receptor characteristics. So sensory receptors may have different characteristics, as you can see right here. In this picture from our textbook, you'll see that simple receptors have free nerve endings at the end, an unmyelinated axon, and a cell body somewhere downstream. So these generally sense painful stimuli, temperature, and light touch. They don't need to respond to abrupt changes in stimulation. Therefore, they're short and often unmyelinated. Complex neural receptors are a little more, well, complex. You'll notice that they have enclosed nerve endings surrounded by layers of connective tissue, as you can see in this example right here, which I believe is a Pacinian corpuscle. These axons are generally myelinated, and we know that myelinated axons allow for quicker transmission of electrical signals. So senses that use this typically are touch. Finally, specialized receptors have accessory characteristics. They may release neurotransmitters or respond to even light stimuli. Generally, these open voltage gated channels that eventually lead to membrane depolarization and generation of action potentials. Senses that utilize this type of receptor generally include gustatory, olfaction, vision, and audio, as well as balance and temperature. So there are four primary types of sensory receptors. Note that I describe characteristics of sensory receptors, but there are four main types here. So, of course, you have your chemoreceptors, which sense stimuli such as oxygen, pH, various organic molecules such as glucose. These typically have more specialized receptors or receptor characteristics, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Mechanoreceptors sense pressure, cell stretching, vibration, acceleration, and sound. These may be complex or non-neural if we're referring back to the previous slide. Photoreceptors, of course, they sense photons or light. A little fun fact here. So more than 50% of sensory receptors in the body actually are found in the eyes. So those are photoreceptors. And finally, there are thermoreceptors. Thermometer, heat, temperature, etc. So these are simple or special sense receptors that detect varying degrees of heat. So let's talk about the ipsilateral pathways to the brain. So ipsilateral, ipsi means same, so same side, basically, pathways to the CNS, the central nervous system. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, ipsilateral means belonging to or occurring on the same side of the body. That is, yeah, same side of the body. So there's general pathway that most sensory information follows from the periphery to the brain. And I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit further. So most of the information from the environment is transduced by our sensory receptors. These then synapse with sensory neurons, which then transmit their information from the periphery to the brain. All senses, actually, with the exception of olfaction, very important. So all senses besides smell, olfaction, cross through the thalamus at one point or another and are then processed in their corresponding cortices. As you can see here, gustatory cortex corresponds to taste. Primary somatic sensory cortex corresponds to, well, things such as balance, pain, temperature, and the various mechanoreceptors or touch. Auditory, of course, that's audio. So listening, visual, of course, is visual or seeing. So these are ipsilateral pathways. Now let's move on to contralateral pathways. Contralateral, of course, means relating to or denoting the side of the body opposite to that on which a particular structure or condition occurs. So contralateral pathways actually decussate. Decussate means to cross or intersect. It's a very important word in neuroscience in the spinal cord or the medulla. So contralateral pathways decussate in the central nervous system. So as you can see through the image, the sensations of pain, temperature, and coarse touch cross the midline down here in the spinal cord, whereas fine touch, vibration, and proprioception, which proprioception, it helps us sense where we are in space. So once again, fine touch, vibration, and proprioception decussate at the medulla, closer to the brain. So these senses are all perceived by the primary somatosensory cortex of the brain, which is up here, but I also talked a little bit about it on the previous slide. Um, so senses are sensed or perceived by the primary somatosensory cortex on the contralateral or the opposite side of the stimuli. So that brings me to this recap. So as we've learned through this presentation, there are many types of sensory receptors that correspond to our five primary senses, as well as our senses of pain, temperature, balance, and yeah, pain, temperature, and balance. These sensory receptors synapse with neurons, and their action potentials are propagated along our our brainstem to the various somatosensory cortices of our brains. So again, not all lead through the brainstem, but they typically do. Overall, these sensory receptors and their pathways lead to the brain and ultimately enable us to perceive our environment. So these are all very important. Here are my citations, and let's get to this worksheet that I showed at the beginning. Okay, so please answer the following questions about sensory receptors and the central nervous system. Answer the best of your ability. Alrighty, so here is a little guide I created for myself, or a study aid, rather. Um, okay, and let's get to it. So define transduction. So transduction is the conversion of stimulus energy into information that can be processed by the brain. Done. Provide examples of senses that are sensed contralaterally. Okay, so contralateral, oop, and also provide examples of senses that are sensed ipsilaterally. So contralateral, vision, touch, pain, temperature, vibration, and proprioception. Now, ipsilateral, audio mostly, as well as smell and taste. Describe the general process and pathway of sensory information. Where does it begin? Where are senses processed? So I'm just going to do a generic sort of outline here. Our so they go through our sensory receptors. It's a stimulus from the stimulus or stimuli from the environment. Go through our sensory receptors. They synapse with sensory neurons. Move into the spinal cord. And I want to make a note that that pulsation often happens. Then that leads to the thalamus, and finally the primary somatosensory cortex. So this specifically relates to somatosensory um, processes, not necessarily vision, hearing, taste, etc. All right, next one. Match these characteristics of receptors with their corresponding anatomical portrayal. So simple, complex, and special. I don't really need to type this one out because it's already in that order, but let's just go simple, complex, and special or non-neural. What are the four main types of sensory receptors? Of course, these are canoreceptors, chemoreceptors, um, temperature. I forgot the right word for that. Temperature, thermo. There we go. Thermoreceptors and photoreceptors. What is considered the sensory checkpoint? That's easy. That's the thalamus. And finally, more than 50% of receptors are found in what? Um, that would be the eyes. Alrighty. And that concludes my presentation, as well as the completion of this little study aid I had prepared for myself. So thank you for listening. Again, this is Michael Lay. If you like what you saw today, please like this video and subscribe to my channel, where I'll post a couple more of these physiology videos. And I also have some anatomy ones up there at the moment as well. Alrighty. Thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye bye.